For today's video, we'll be returning to the Imperial German Navy, and a ship that was, for the time, one of the best of her type, SMS Scharnhorst, one of Germany's final armored cruisers. Not the far more famous battleship of later years. The Scharnhorst-class cruisers were the final class of German armored cruiser. The only ship to come after them, SMS Blucher, was a one-off, and a one-off intended to counter what the Germans thought would be HMS Invincible. In comparison, while certainly capable ships, the Scharnhorsts are more in line with typical armored cruisers. This made them perfectly sufficient for their duties when they were designed. However, by the time the ships entered service, that had changed. Invincible was fitting out, and armored cruisers were becoming obsolescent, which would have disastrous consequences for these ships in the Great War. Although that comes later. When Scharnhorst was laid down, the Germans didn't know any of this. Nowhere is this more apparent than in her design, because Scharnhorst was, in the end, not a revolutionary ship. She was the culmination of German design trends in armored cruisers. Iterative, not innovative. During this design process, the German Navy decided on a new strategy. Armored cruisers would need to fight in the line of battle. This wasn't meant to be their primary role, but one they could take up when it was necessary. And this was a concept that would endure through the change to battlecruisers. For Scharnhorst, this meant a jump in size, to allow for heavier armor and heavier firepower. As a result, Scharnhorst was a fairly large ship, with a displacement of 11,616 tons at her standard loading, and just under 13,000 tons when fully loaded. On that displacement, she carried a heavier broadside than previous German designs, consisting of 8 21-centimeter or 8.3-inch guns, 4 and 2 twin turrets, one on the bow and one on the stern, with the other 4 in broadside casements, where they would be joined by 6 15-centimeter or 5.9-inch secondary guns in similar mountings, with the weaponry rounded off by 18 88mm guns and 4 torpedo tubes. So with that covered, we can move on to armor protection. On Scharnhorst, this came out to 150mm or 5.9 inches on the main belt. This primarily covered the machinery space located amidships, with the belt extending to the forward conning tower towards the bow, and to just aft of the rear conning tower on the stern. Beyond this citadel protection, the belt thinned out to 80mm or 3.1 inches towards the bow, with similar armor on the aft end, although it didn't reach the extreme stern. As for deck protection, this was 60mm or 2.4 inches at its thickest, thinning down to 35mm, 1.4 inches, in less critical areas. And with all of that out of the way, all that's left is her speed. Scharnhorst could reach around 22.5 knots on 26,000 indicated horsepower, through 3 shafts in this case. Scharnhorst did manage 23.5 knots on trials, but the usual thing of trial speed is rarely the same as service speed still applies here. In any event, this rounds off the design. As you can see, Scharnhorst was a powerful ship. However, that would not stop her from becoming obsolescent as soon as she entered service. Scharnhorst was laid down on March 22, 1905, and launched on March 23, 1906, with her commissioning following on October 24th, 1907. This was a pretty standard construction period. Unfortunately for the Germans, technology had marched on during it. HMS Invincible was launched on April 13th, 1907, and her construction marked the end of the armored cruiser as a concept going forward. Unfortunate, certainly, but not catastrophic. Scharnhorst was still a perfectly capable ship and would give good, if admittedly short, service, even if it wouldn't begin immediately. During her working up phase, in November of 1907, Scharnhorst was pulled off her trials. The ship was attached to escort Kaiser Wilhelm on a voyage to Britain and the Netherlands. This ran from November 6th to November 11th of 1907, and was largely uneventful, with the cruiser returning to working up after it concluded, at least at first. As 1907 gave way to 1908, Scharnhorst would have an accident. The armored cruiser ran aground on January 14th, 1908, causing some pretty serious underwater damage. Not enough to sink her, but enough to force the cruiser to dry dock. Repairs for this lasted until February 22nd. Between the Kaiser's voyage and the damage she suffered in the grounding, Scharnhorst only finished her final trials in April of 1908, with the ship finally entering proper service on May 1st, when she took over as flagship of the High Seas Fleet Reconnaissance Forces. An admittedly short-lived duty. Scharnhorst would serve in this role on the usual peacetime training for only about a year, because on March 11th of 1909, the cruiser was reassigned, in this case as flagship of Germany's East Asia Squadron based out of China. This would remain her duty for the rest of the cruiser's service life. Scharnhorst departed Germany on April 1st, 1909, arriving in China later that year. The initial service here would be about what you'd expect. Scharnhorst spent the rest of 1909 familiarizing her crew with the area. This entailed multiple port visits and a cruise through the Yellow Sea, something that would occupy most of Scharnhorst's time for the following 5 years. She would do the usual colonial flagship duty, sailing around and showing the flag. Not much of note would happen outside of that service. She would earn a prize for her gunnery in 1910, and was present when her sister Gneisenau joined the East Asia Squadron in March of 1911. The cruiser also gained a new commander on December 4th, 1912, Maximilian von Spee. That man would remain in command of the East Asia Squadron for the rest of its service, which remained fairly quiet for the most part until 1914, at which point things changed with the outbreak of the Great War. The East Asia Squadron was recalled from far-off stations, gathering up the cruisers. Spee was a smart commander, however, and realized even the entire squadron was heavily outmatched. If Japan joined the war, as they would, the squadron stood no chance. So he didn't even attempt to hold the Chinese colonies, instead setting out into the Pacific. Most of the squadron would stick together past a certain point, with the exception of SMS Emden. Her story is a famous one for another day. For his part, Spee continued on. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were joined by SMS Nuremberg, with word of the Allied capture of Germany's colony in Samoa on August 29, 1914. While still cautious, and for very good reason, Spee would take his big cruisers to investigate. He planned on catching an Allied ship, but he found nothing. So instead, the ships attacked the French colony, of Papiette or Papette, I think. This resulted in the sinking of a French gunboat on September 22nd. Empty-handed, aside from the gunboat sinking, Spey departed. He sailed his cruisers to Easter Island, where they were joined by the remaining members of the East Asia Squadron, SMS Leipzig and SMS Dresden, bringing Spey's overall force to 2 armored cruisers and 3 light cruisers on October 14th. All things considered, this was an impressive enough force, and it would soon be put to the test as Spey received a report about a British cruiser in Coronel, Chile. That ship was HMS Glasgow, which Spey wanted to ambush. British forces in the area, for their part, were not heavy. Most of the Royal Navy was concentrated in the North Sea. What they had available consisted of 2 armored cruisers, HMS Good Hope and HMS Monmouth, along with Glasgow, a light cruiser, and the armed merchant cruiser Otranto. In addition, they received reinforcements from an old pre-dreadnought Canopus, which couldn't keep up, so she was left behind. Now this doesn't seem particularly lopsided. Spey had 2 more light cruisers, but the British matched his armored cruisers. Except not really. The British cruisers, under Christopher Craddock, were older and less heavily armed. Not bad ships, but outmatched by the more modern Scharnhorst sisters. Then again, I say that, but those armored cruisers were actually meant to be scrapped, had the war not intervened. Still, Monmouth and Good Hope were not bad ships, just outclassed in comparison. In any event, with rough weather further degrading the British ability to fight back, Spey moved in. His well-drilled and experienced crews battered the inexperienced British reservists. At the Battle of Coronel on November 1st, 1914, both Good Hope and Monmouth were sent to the bottom, with no survivors. Glasgow and Otranto, for their parts, escaped when it became apparent they could do nothing to help. As for the Germans, they suffered no notable damage or losses, at least in terms of crew. Spey had actually used up a fairly large portion of his ammunition between the French colony and now Coronel. At this point, the decision was made to round Cape Horn and return to the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the British, smarting from their crushing defeat, sent forces to catch the Germans. Most importantly, this included 2 of the first battlecruisers, HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible. They were detached from the Grand Fleet and sent to the Falklands, along with 3 armored cruisers, Carnarvon, Kent, and Cornwall, with 2 light cruisers coming along, HMS Bristol and the survivor of Coronel, HMS Glasgow. Spey's ships, meanwhile, rounded Cape Horn on December 2nd, 1914. They captured a Canadian ship and took on her cargo of coal. Then, a few days later, Spey made the decision on December 6th to sail for the Falklands. This would result in the Battle of the Falkland Islands. The German vessels arrived on December 8th, 1914, with Gneisenau and Nuremberg in the lead. They were fired on by HMS Canopus, beached as a guard ship. Spey broke off his attack in an understandable retreat. Soon after he did so, the British formation, which had arrived in November, set sail. Invincible and Inflexible were in the lead, doing exactly what they were designed for, overhauling and running down enemy armored cruisers. Recognizing the danger, Spey sent his light cruisers away. He turned Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which had no hope of escape, to cover their retreat. To the Germans' credit, their armored cruisers continued to demonstrate superb gunnery. They landed more than a few hits, but their weaponry just couldn't do enough damage. Scharnhorst was eventually pounded into a capsizing wreck, after Spey attempted to cover Gneisenau's retreat. A brave, but ultimately futile gesture. Soon after Scharnhorst rolled over and sank, Gneisenau would be sunk in turn. Leipzig and Nuremberg would join her, while Dresden was eventually scuttled in port. As for Scharnhorst, not a single member of the crew would be rescued. Spey and 2 of his sons were lost in the battle. However, that isn't where the story ended. A member of Scharnhorst's crew was found off the coast of Brazil. His body was carrying a watertight cartridge case containing one of the war flags from the cruiser. The sailor was buried in Brazil and the flag sent on to Germany, where it would be lost in the Second World War. And in addition, the wreck of Scharnhorst was eventually located in 2019. I have a video on that, which I'll link in the description. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.